After seizing Crimea in 2014, Russia's President Vladimir Putin stated that the peninsula will remain part of Russia from now on and forever. Fast forward 12 years, however, and that promise seems increasingly impossible for Putin to keep. As Ukrainian long-range drone and missile attacks on the region intensify, severing its supply routes and plunging the peninsula to an unprecedented crisis, Russia's control of Crimea looks weaker than ever. In fact, Putin himself may have officially given up any hope of holding the region, and the actions of his own people are proving it. For historians, these events will come as no surprise. Plenty of great global powers have claimed control of the Crimean peninsula over the ages, but none were ever able to hold it in perpetuity. The earliest recorded invasion of the region dates all the way back to 513 BCE. It was then that the Persian Empire, under the command of Darius I, launched a major campaign into the region. As the centuries passed, control fell into the hands of the Greeks, the Romans, even the Byzantine Empire, with the first great siege of Crimea arriving in the 14th century when Golden Horde Mongol forces targeted the Genoese-controlled city of Kaffa, which is known today as Feodossia. The Mongols surrounded and attacked the city from 1343 to 1346, until they eventually suffered a mass outbreak of the bubonic plague. Not wanting to lift the siege and head back home, the attackers instead orchestrated one of the world's first ever examples of biological warfare. They catapulted plague-infected corpses into the city, which not only forced the Genoese to flee, but also led to the spread of the Black Death across the Mediterranean and beyond. In the centuries that followed, Crimea saw plenty more sieges, invasions, and valiant but ultimately futile last-stand attempts. There was the legendary siege of Sevastopol, for example, which occurred during the Crimean War and lasted almost a year, from October 1854 through September 1855. This involved a coalition of allied powers, including Britain, France, the Ottoman Empire, and Sardinia, surrounding and bombarding the city, which Russians attempted to defend by building a vast ring of bastions all around it. Even though disease, frost, and starvation took their toll on the Allied forces, they emerged victorious in the end, with the remaining Russians forced to flee. In 1920, Crimea was the location of the anti-Bolshevik White Army during the Russian Civil War. The fractured remnants of the force attempted to hold down the Perekop Isthmus, a narrow strip of land joining the peninsula to the mainland, against the oncoming Red Army. They managed to buy enough time for around 150,000 soldiers and civilians to escape via the sea towards Istanbul, but eventually buckled beneath the sheer weight of the opposing force. World War II gave us yet another example of how, far from being some sort of impenetrable fortress, Crimea is actually one of the toughest places in the world to hold on to. In 1941, as Axis forces cut off the land routes to the Crimean peninsula, Soviet soldiers retreated to the port city of Sevastopol. The Germans made multiple failed attempts to capture the city during the latter months of the year, before eventually building up a massive force and bombarding Sevastopol with heavy railway guns and Luftwaffe bombing runs. By July 1942, the Soviets' defensive lines had all but collapsed, with tens of thousands of troops either killed or captured, and the Axis secured control of Crimea. Just a couple of years later, in 1944, the Soviets retook control, copying the Nazis' playbook by first cutting off the German army by land before concentrating large amounts of heavy fire on Sevastopol itself. While the details vary, many of these examples highlight the inherent challenges in holding a place like Crimea. And those challenges ultimately boil down to one simple thing, something that even the most powerful and wealthy nations of the world can't ever truly control: geography. Crimea's unique geography is both its biggest strength and biggest weakness. It's naturally protected by vast bodies of water to the east, west, and south, for example. But that also means that land access is extremely limited. For thousands of years, the only way to get in or out of Crimea via land was to the north, passing through the southern regions of Ukraine. And even though the peninsula is rich in certain resources, it's not self-sufficient. Any power that wants to control it has always had to find ways to funnel food, fuel, water, and other supplies into the region. That's the key: the supply lines. On so many occasions throughout history, invading forces have focused on cutting those lines to effectively make Crimea impossible for their enemy to control. Once food and fuel stop flowing, it's only a matter of time until the occupying force has to wave the white flag or withdraw. We've seen that exact same scenario play out time after time. Over and over again, isolation of the peninsula preceded the defeat of its defenders. It didn't matter how tall their fortress walls were, how many fortifications they set up, how many trenches they dug or bunkers they built, or how well they fought off any invaders that got too close. They would always have to give in the end, if they ran out of resources. And those same historical lessons still apply today. After claiming control of Crimea, Putin seemed to believe that the hard part was over. In reality, it was only just beginning. Taking the peninsula has never actually been that hard. Holding it is the true challenge. On some level, Putin seemed to understand this. Historical events likely influenced his decision to order the construction of the Kerch Strait Bridge, for example, the 12-mile, 19 feet of engineering that cost nearly $4 billion to build and linked Crimea's eastern tip with the Russian mainland. This opened up a new passage to and from the peninsula. When he ordered the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, Putin also focused on the key regions he needed to take complete control of the so-called land corridor linking Russia to Crimea, namely Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson. The logic was clear to see. If Putin controlled the territories around Crimea, there would be no way for any enemy, be it Ukraine or even NATO, to cut the supply lines and isolate the region. At least, that's how it seemed. Then Ukraine found a new strategy, a strategy that allowed it to sever Crimea's connections without even needing to control the likes of Kherson or Zaporizhia. A strategy that manifested in the form of the Middle Strike campaign, which began in early April 2026 and involves Ukrainian forces using one-way attack drones to target the transport routes and logistical nodes that Russia uses to essentially feed Crimea. Since the campaign began, we've witnessed increasing numbers of strikes on the Kremlin's military logistics across the occupied regions of Ukraine, especially focusing on the so-called Novorossiya highway, a major road that stretches all the way from the international border into Crimea and has for years been the primary artery Russia relies on to get troops, military equipment, food, fuel, and more to the peninsula. That same highway has since been nicknamed the Highway of Death by Russian soldiers and military bloggers due to the sheer intensity and effectiveness of Ukraine's drone strikes, which have left trucks in flames and entire convoys in ruins. Ukraine has also focused on cutting all other connections to the peninsula, repeatedly striking and threatening the Kerch Strait Bridge, while also destroying Russia's railway ferries and the so-called Shadow Fleet vessels heading towards Crimea. In short, rather than launching some sort of costly ground assault that could involve massive losses and weaken Ukraine and other areas across the front lines, Kyiv's forces have instead made smart use of their ever-expanding drone army to make it as challenging as possible for Russia to resupply or reinforce Crimea. It may not look like it at first glance, but as retired United States Army Officer General Ben Hodges recently stated during an interview on the Global Gambit, this is, in effect, classic siege tactics. Hodges notes that Ukraine is committed to the isolation of the peninsula by going after the transportation infrastructure that it depends on. As a result, the former commanding general of United States Army Europe explains that many people are leaving the area. Not just unhappy, disappointed vacationers, but even some government officials, people realizing that Crimea is becoming a trap, if you will, and they're trying to get out of there. And according to one Russian official, Putin may have already accepted that he's lost control of the peninsula. But before we get into exactly what was said, you're watching The Military Show, and if you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time. While Putin hasn't acknowledged the crisis in Crimea publicly, and the Kremlin continues to rely on its classic propaganda tactics to downplay the drama, one expert, Moscow-born economist Igor Lipsitz, believes that the Russian president is already implementing a Crimean escape plan. In an interview with Mark Fagin, former member of the Russian State Duma, who today works as a human rights activist, Lipsitz claimed that Putin is already in the process of withdrawing from Crimea and is putting the pieces in place to justify this decision in the eyes of the general public. He explained that the president has no intention of organizing a humanitarian evacuation or green corridor for Russians who remain stranded in Crimea, as it would be too humiliating for the Kremlin to have to ask Ukraine to stop its strikes so that the evacuation could take place. Instead, Moscow intends to remain silent on the issue and shift blame onto Ukraine later, on when people inevitably die due to the rapidly declining and increasingly dangerous conditions across the region. From a humanitarian perspective, people should be evacuated, and those who can should leave via the bridge. That's obvious, but it will not happen. Putin will say that the people died because of Ukraine. He doesn't care how many civilians in Crimea die. whether children or the elderly, due to lack of medicine, electricity, or functioning hospitals. He's fighting his own war, and ordinary Russians are expendable. During the same interview, Lipsitz also compared the situation in Crimea to a siege, stating, "There are water shortages and electricity supplies becoming unstable after successful Ukrainian strikes on energy infrastructure. Aside from the Crimean bridge, communications are largely cut off, lines of cars leaving Crimea are at record levels. Russians suddenly realize they need to leave immediately. It's both alarming and absurd. It shows a very low level of awareness in Russia." Indeed, up until the early summer of 2026, the Russian public largely seemed to believe that Crimea was perfectly safe. Many booked vacations there for the warm summer months, intending to enjoy the peninsula's relaxing resorts, spas and beaches, while hundreds of thousands of Russians have reportedly relocated to Crimea permanently since the illegal annexation in 2014. Many of these people made these decisions based on what Putin told them. He said Crimea was and would be Russian forever. He claimed it was a safe place that had returned to its home harbor and actively encouraged Russian citizens to visit the peninsula, buy homes there, start businesses, and so on. The people believed him, so flocked to Crimea in their droves. Now, however, they're seeing the error of their ways, but for many, it's already too late. Of course, Ukraine isn't targeting civilians directly. It's not like Russia. It doesn't intentionally go about bombing people's homes and blowing up the likes of hospitals, churches, and schools. However, in severing the supply lines to the region, Kyiv's forces are making it a far harder place to live in, not just for soldiers, but regular people too. A region-wide state of emergency has been declared, locals have been largely banned from buying fuel, since there's such a lack of it, and many homes and businesses face recurring blackouts and water shortages too. As a result, many Russians living or holidaying in Crimea are rushing for the exits, with mile-long lines of cars forming in the direction of the Kerch Strait Bridge, and countless people posting on social media to express their fears and frustrations, urging their fellow citizens to get out or stay far away from Crimea, and calling out Putin directly for his apparent lack of action. Once again, regular people are suffering because of their president's hubris. Putin could do something about this. He could divert troops and resources to aid in the evacuation of Crimea. He could openly acknowledge the issue and tell the people that he's doing everything in his power to help them. He could do the honorable thing and establish a humanitarian corridor to ensure that his people can flee the area safely. But he hasn't, and likely won't do any of that. Instead, he remains selectively silent, hoping that the rest of Russia won't notice what a hellhole Crimea has become, relying on his familiar tactics of lies and propaganda to cover up the crisis. However, as noted by Dr. Orhan Dragas, a Serbian expert on security and international relations, in an article for the Kyiv Post, television can keep repeating that Crimea is Russian forever, but it cannot stabilize the grid, fill fuel tanks, ensure regular supplies, shorten waits at the bridge, or persuade families to stay where they no longer believe they're safe. Since 2014, the Russian government has used Crimea as the ultimate political symbol. It's been Putin's crown jewel, and the annexation of what he calls an unsinkable aircraft carrier felt for years like his greatest triumph. Even when the full-scale invasion of Ukraine began, Russia's control of Crimea never seemed like it would be called into question. Places like Donetsk and Luhansk were described as conflict zones and battlefields, but Crimea remained a calm, stable and settled state, a picturesque vacation spot and a symbol of Russia's ability not just to take territory, but to keep it. Regardless of how this so-called special military operation in the Donbass unfolded, Putin likely imagined generations of Russians singing his name and celebrating the legacy long after he was gone, as they continued to bask on the beaches of the Black Sea for decades to come. Ukraine has smashed that dream into 1,000 pieces, bringing Putin right back down to earth with its remarkable Middle Strike campaign. Learning the lessons of the past, it's followed in the footsteps of the Allied coalition of the Crimean War, the Red Army of the Russian Civil War, and even the Axis powers of WW2, isolating the peninsula, stopping its supplies, and making it almost impossible to hold on to. And it doesn't matter whether Putin admits it or not. The facts on the ground speak for themselves. Logistics are failing, resources aren't moving, people are panicking. And all the signs suggest that the situation isn't going to get any better anytime soon. In fact, it's likely to keep on getting worse. Ukraine has the weapons it needs to continue its campaign and has already started intensifying its attacks, with far more recorded in June than in May, for example. It also blew up several Shadow Fleet vessels that Russia had attempted to use to funnel supplies into Crimea by sea, and clearly has the means to attack or even destroy the Kerch Strait Bridge should it choose to do so. For the early years of the war, the peninsula wasn't just a safe place where Russians went on vacation. It was also a massive military logistics node, a southern base from which the Kremlin's forces could launch attacks on Kherson and Zaporizhia, or fire missiles and drone swarms deeper into Ukraine. But that's no longer the case. As Dr. Dragas states, Ukraine has transformed Crimea from a safe rear into a space of constant exposure, and it's not going to stop. Which leaves us with one simple question: what will Putin do next? According to Lipsitz and others, the pressure may eventually prove too much for the Russian president to bear. Dragas believes he might attempt to splinter the crisis into a string of small excuses, falsifying stories about sabotage and technical failures in the region, blaming the local administration for failing to uphold sufficient standards of care and control, and eventually accusing Ukraine of cruelly targeting innocent Russian citizens in the region. This is how Putin operates. He seeks scapegoats and shifts blame as far away from himself as humanly possible. It might work with some parts of the Russian population, but it's not going to work with the hundreds of thousands in Crimea itself, who are seeing their lives get worse by the day. The people who are suffering blackouts and fuel shortages, the families who can no longer turn on their lights or get enough food to feed themselves, and the holiday makers who are sold a lie by their president and unknowingly book trips to a battle zone. As Dr. Dragas puts it, the greatest weakness in Putin's Crimea story lies in the nature of the promise itself. He didn't simply say that Crimea was temporarily occupied or a contested military zone. He said it was Russian forever. Now, those words have come back to bite him. You can learn more about the countless crises facing the Russian president in this video, which looks at how Russia's wartime economy is under unprecedented strain and is fast approaching the point of complete collapse. Alternatively, check out this video for a detailed breakdown of how one tiny Ukrainian village has proven absolutely impossible for Russia to capture, representing one of the most humiliating failures in the country's entire military history. And finally, don't forget to subscribe to The Military Show for more breaking news reports and insightful analysis of the latest stories from the Russia-Ukraine war and other conflicts worldwide.